Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going south.
To the south.
Yeah, way back to the late 1960s.
Oh, wow.
Through 1980.
Okay.
You might think
All right.
you know this era, but trust me, we've got research and perspectives
Yeah.
that will completely change how you view this.
It's a fascinating time period.
Moment in American history.
Yeah.
Think school desegregation.
Yes.
The rise of black political power, and a whole lot more.
A lot going on.
We're talking a time when the South was wrestling with its past, trying to shake off
Yes.
the shackles of Jim Crow and segregation.
Right.
Imagine a world where just a few years earlier, separate drinking fountains and segregated schools were the norm.
It's hard to fathom.
It really is.
Really is.
So let's dive right in.
Okay.
What were some of the big wins during this period?
Oh, yeah.
Because I know there were some landmark legal changes
Huge legal changes.
that happened.
Absolutely. Let's start with the heavy hitters.
Okay.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Okay.
These weren't just pieces of paper.
Right.
They were game changers. The federal government finally put its foot down and said, enough is enough.
Okay. So those are the big names everyone's heard of. But what did they actually do?
Yes.
I mean, how did they change life for people on the ground?
Well, think about schools in 1964.
Okay.
A staggering 68% of Southern schools were still segregated.
Wow.
Fast forward just 6 years to 1970.
Okay.
And that number plummets to a mere 8%.
Wow. That's incredible progress in such a short time.
A seismic shift.
But I imagine it wasn't just about changing the laws.
Right? You're right.
There had to be people pushing for these changes, fighting for their rights.
Absolutely. Social historians really emphasize the power of everyday people in this era.
Okay.
They highlight the tireless work of local movements and community organizing that kept the pressure on pushing for change at every level.
So it wasn't just happening from the top down, it was also bubbling up from the grassroots. And, sometimes a personal story can really bring history to life.
Oh, for sure.
There's this incredible account from a young student who experienced desegregation firsthand.
Wow.
She talks about the fear and uncertainty she felt walking into a previously all-white school,
Yeah,
but also the sense of hope and possibility that came with it.
of course.
It's a powerful reminder that behind the statistics, there were real people navigating these monumental changes.
For sure. Absolutely.
That's so important to remember the human impact of these events.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got desegregation in schools. What about political power?
Yeah.
I know there were some major breakthroughs in that area as well.
Absolutely. The Voting Rights Act was a game changer for Black political participation.
Okay.
For example, in Georgia,
Okay.
Black voter registration skyrocketed to 27% by 1980.
Wow.
And then you have the incredible story of Maynard Jackson's election as Atlanta's first Black mayor in 1973.
That's huge.
Talk about a symbol of progress.
But I'm guessing even with more first, Black voters translating those votes into actual political power wasn't always easy.
Right. You're right.
Yeah.
While the number of Black elected officials did grow, representation still lagged behind the proportion of Black citizens. It's like taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back.
Okay.
Take Georgia in 1980.
Right.
Despite Black citizens making up a quarter of registered voters,
All right.
there were only 249 Black elected officials,
Okay.
a mere 3.7% of the state's total.
So clearly, there was still a long way to go even with these landmark legal victories.
It shows you.
It's a reminder that changing laws is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Exactly.
There's a whole other layer of systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Precisely. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Historians have spent a lot of time debating just how transformative this era really was.
Okay.
The traditionalists see it as a resounding success story focusing on the undeniable progress in desegregation. Voting rights and economic opportunities, they view it as the culmination of the civil rights movement's goals.
Okay. That's one perspective.
Yeah.
What were some of the other viewpoints?
Right.
Because I'm guessing not everyone agrees with that interpretation.
Then you have the continuity historians who see this era as part of a longer arc of change going all the way back to the New Deal.
Oh, wow.
They argue that while the Civil Rights Act and other legislation were significant milestones,
Okay.
they were building upon groundwork laid decades earlier.
So they're saying it's all connected, part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. And then you have the revisionists who are a bit more critical, arguing that despite the legal victories, real change wasn't as deep or widespread as it seemed.
Okay.
They point to the fact that many African Americans remain trapped in poverty, facing persistent social and economic marginalization.
So for them, it's about looking beyond the headlines and seeing the complexities that were often overlooked.
Precisely, for example, even in Atlanta, which was considered a shining example of progress, a third of Black residents were still living below the poverty line in 1980.
Wow, that's a stark reminder that progress isn't always evenly distributed.
Exactly. And it leads us to another important group of historians, the social historians,
Yep.
who remind us that real progress wasn't just about legislation handed down from on high.
Right.
They focus on the grassroots activism that drove these changes.
Yeah.
The everyday people who organized, protested, and demanded better for their communities.
Okay, so we've got these different historical perspectives, each offering a unique lens on this era. But let's bring it back to you listening right now. Why should this period in history matter to someone living in the present day?
Well, think about it this way. We're still wrestling with many of the same issues today.
Yeah.
Racial inequality, economic disparities, and the fight for true social justice. Understanding how these issues played out in the past can give us valuable insights into the challenges we face today.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding the mistakes of the past. It's also about recognizing the strategies that worked,
Right.
the movements that made a difference, and the power of collective action.
So it's about learning from both the triumphs and the setbacks of this era
Yes.
and using that knowledge to inform our own actions in the present.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this period in history so relevant and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that progress is rarely a straight line. There will be bumps along the way,
Yeah.
moments of frustration and disappointment, but it's crucial to keep pushing forward, to learn from the past, and to never give up on the fight for a more just and equitable future.
And on that note, let's take a quick pause to let everything sink in when we come back. We'll delve even deeper into the complexities of this era, exploring the enduring social and economic challenges that persisted despite the legal victories.
Oh.
All right, so we've talked about the landmark legislation, the different historical perspectives, and the power of grassroots activism.
Yes.
But I think we need to dig a little deeper into the economic realities of this era.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned earlier, even with all the progress, poverty and economic inequality remained huge problems.
That's right. It's like this. Imagine you're trying to build a house,
Okay,
but the foundation is cracked and unstable.
okay.
You can put up new walls, add a fresh coat of paint.
Right.
But if you don't fix that foundation, the whole structure is still at risk.
That's a great analogy. So what was the cracked foundation in this case?
Right.
What were the systemic issues that were holding people back?
Well, for starters, job discrimination was still rampant, even with the EEOC in place.
Right.
Many Black Southerners found themselves shut out of higher-paying jobs,
Wow.
stuck in low-wage work with little chance of advancement.
So it's like the opportunities were there on paper, but the reality was much more complicated.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of housing segregation.
Right.
Many Black families were confined to overcrowded, under-resourced neighborhoods, further limiting their access to good schools, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
Yeah. It's almost like a vicious cycle.
Right.
One problem feeding into another.
Precisely. And, statistics can sometimes feel abstract, but they tell a powerful story. Remember how we talked about Atlanta being a symbol of progress?
Yes.
Well, even there, a third of Black residents remained below the poverty line in 1980.
Yeah, that statistic really stuck with me. It shows that even in a city with a Black mayor and a growing Black middle-class poverty was still a deeply entrenched problem.
It's a sobering reminder that legal changes alone aren't enough to dismantle centuries of systemic oppression. And this is a point that revisionist historians really drive home.
Okay.
They argue that while Johnson's Great Society programs, especially those focused on education and affirmative action,
Right.
did create opportunities for Black economic advancement, they simply weren't enough to overcome the historical disadvantages that had accumulated over generations.
So it's like those policies were a step in the right direction, but they didn't fully address the root causes of the problem.
Exactly. It's like trying to treat a serious illness with a Band-Aid. You might alleviate some of the symptoms,
Right.
but you're not addressing the underlying condition.
Okay, so we've got these economic challenges, and we know the Supreme Court played a role in shaping voting rights during this time.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court's decisions during this era were a mixed bag, reflecting the push and pull between progress and resistance. On one hand, You have the 1976 Beer v. United States case,
Okay.
where the court actually supported redistricting efforts aimed at improving Black representation.
So a win for voting rights.
Yes, but then just a few years later, in 1980, the court took a step back with the City of Mobile v. Bolden decision. This ruling made it much harder to challenge discriminatory voting practices, because it basically said you had to prove discriminatory intent, which is a really high bar to clear.
So it sounds like the court was sending mixed signals, sometimes supporting voting rights and sometimes making it harder to protect those rights.
That's a good way to put it, and this back and forth reflects the broader complexities of this period. You have these incredible strides towards equality, but at the same time, there are these persistent barriers that are incredibly difficult to dismantle.
I guess it's a reminder that progress isn't always linear. There will be setbacks and challenges along the way.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand these nuances to see the full picture of this era, both the progress and the limitations.
It makes you wonder, what would it have taken to achieve a more complete transformation? What other approaches might have been more effective in addressing those deeply rooted systemic issues?
That's a question historians are still grappling with today. Some argue that a more radical redistribution of wealth and resources would have been necessary to truly level the playing field. Others point to the need for more comprehensive social programs that addressed issues like housing, healthcare, and education in a more holistic way.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, no magic bullet solution.
Right, but what we can learn from this period is that lasting change requires both legal and societal transformation. It's not enough to simply change the laws. You also need to change hearts and minds and address the underlying economic and social structures that perpetuate inequality.
And I think that's a message that resonates far beyond the South and this specific historical period. It's something we need to keep in mind as we continue to grapple with these issues today.
Absolutely. The fight for equality is an ongoing process, and understanding the complexities of this era in the South can give us valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into this pivotal period in American history, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture. What's the lasting legacy of this era? What are the key takeaways that we should all remember?
It's a complex legacy full of contradictions. On the one hand, you have these undeniable advancements, the dismantling of legal segregation, the expansion of voting rights, and the rise of a Black middle class. But on the other hand, you have the persistence of poverty, discrimination, and social inequalities.
It's almost like a two-sided coin. You can't fully appreciate the progress without acknowledging the challenges that continue to exist.
Precisely, and I think that's the key to understanding this period. It wasn't a complete transformation, but rather a period of significant progress alongside enduring obstacles.
It's a reminder that change takes time, and it's rarely a smooth or straightforward process. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of frustration, but the key is to keep moving forward, to keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's where the work of historians becomes so crucial by examining the past. By uncovering those complexities and contradictions, they help us understand the present and chart a course for the future.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the South's transformation, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
I'd say the most important takeaway is that history is a complex and nuanced process. It's full of progress and setbacks, victories and defeats, and it's our responsibility to understand those complexities so that we can learn from the past and build a more just and equitable future.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just something that's in the past. It's still affecting us today.
And the South's journey during this era is a perfect example of that. You know, we've seen those incredible strides towards equality, but also those stubborn reminders of how much work remains. It's both inspiring and challenging at the same time.
It really is. And it's relevant to us today, no matter where we live or what our background is, because we're still grappling with a lot of those same issues.
Oh, absolutely.
Racial injustice.
Yeah.
Economic disparity.
Yeah.
The struggle for true equality.
Yeah.
We're all carrying this history with us.
We are.
Whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And just like in the South, during this era, progress on these issues is not always a neat and tidy upward trajectory.
Right.
There will be times when it feels like we're taking 2 steps forward and then getting knocked back a step.
Yes.
It can be incredibly frustrating.
It can be. And I think that's where it's so easy to lose hope.
Yeah.
To feel like nothing ever really changes.
Yeah.
But even those setbacks, those moments of frustration, they're all part of the story.
They are.
They're reminders that change takes time. And it requires constant effort, constant vigilance.
Well said. And that's why I think the work of historians is so important.
Yeah.
By digging into the past,
Yeah.
unearthing those complexities and contradictions, they're helping us make sense of the present and guide us towards a better future. They're giving us a map, but it's a map with all the detours and roadblocks clearly marked.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the South's transformation, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Okay. I think the most crucial takeaway is this history isn't a passive thing. It's not just something that happened to other people in some distant time. It's a living, breathing force that shapes our world in profound ways. And each of us has a role to play in shaping the next chapter of that story.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to something you said earlier about the importance of grassroots activism. The power of everyday people to make change. You know, we don't have to be historians or politicians to make a difference. We can all be agents of change in our own communities in our own ways.
Absolutely. The fight for equality, for justice is an ongoing process, and it requires all of us to participate. And understanding the complexities of the past, learning from both the triumphs and failures of those who came before us, we can equip ourselves to be more effective, more informed, and ultimately more successful in creating a world that truly lives up to its ideals.
That's a perfect note to end on. So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a pivotal period in American history. We hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about the future. We're building together one step at a time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.